coaching carousel spins on, and Brian Flores still isn't off of it. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. I appreciate y'all so very much. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Today is Twitter Tuesday. That means I'm answering your questions as submitted to me via Twitter, via Blue Sky, via the Google form in the show notes, or you can always just send me an email at lockedonvikingspodcast@gmail.com. First question comes from Smith22Vikes, who asks, why does Ben Johnson hate the rest of the NFC North? This is, I'm assuming, in response to Ben Johnson taking the head coaching job of the Bears, so the Vikings will still have to play that guy twice a year, just in Chicago this time. And the way that is, I'm fascinated to see how that changes things over there. Not to make this about the Bears and Lions, because there's Locked On Bears and Locked On Lions. You could go listen about those. But I am just like academically curious about how much of what made the Lions successful will go with Ben Johnson, leave Detroit, and go to Chicago. How much of it is replicable? How much of it the Lions can still do without him? And how a scheme like what Ben Johnson does, which is not unlike the Vikings, very timing based. Everything is pure progressions. Everything is based on hitch timings, and like a level of precision that the last both the guy, Thomas Brown, Shane Waldron, both those guys did not ask Caleb Williams to do it, and I didn't see it in college, so I kind of got it. It's like, well, that's not his game, but now it's going to have to be. Very interested in that fit to see exactly what Ben Johnson cooks up. If he square peg round holes it, or if he can get Caleb Williams to do that stuff or what. Very interesting. But a couple of things that means that was the Bears' job, was one of the jobs that Brian Flores was in for. So check that one off the list. You can also check the Jaguars off the list, who did a whole bunch of second round interviews. Doesn't look like they're going to request one from Brian Flores. Doesn't look like he made it to the second round. So it's kind of the Jets or nobody, or maybe a surprise. I don't know what's going on with the Cowboys. I don't know what's going on with the Raiders. I don't think that either of those teams have finalized their lists yet, so an interview request could still come. But we're starting to narrow down the options, and it's starting to look more plausible for Brian Flores to stick around, which is like, you got to chill out in, November after a good defensive game going, well, now he's definitely going to be a head coach. Well, maybe everybody just hires someone else. There's a lot of hot coordinators. So that's that. Why does Ben Johnson hate the rest of the NFC North? I don't know. Probably because he swept it. I would stay. Like, you can 2-0 the Packers and 2-0 the Vikings and go to another team and go do it again. Like, all right, yeah, sure. Those defenses now, especially if those coordinators stick around. Jeff Hafley even got an interview with, I think it was the Bears. So, maybe I don't know. I would take it. I get it. And also, by the way, he's getting paid like the most a first-time head coach has ever been paid, like $13 million a year, which is kind of funny. It's like, ooh, Marcus Davenport money, but that's what it is for coaches. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me, and was pretty heavily rumored throughout the whole process. Next one comes from Kate. We have a couple here kind of second guessing and doing a little bit of, wrap up on the playoff game, which now that we've had a couple weeks to digest and, a whole other weekend of someone else's heartbreaks to enjoy, it gets a little bit easier to think about emotionally. So we can take these now. Casey asks, why do you think they did not change things up at the playoff game by switching out QB for at least one series? Give Sam a break, mess with the defense, just a change to settle things down. Isn't that what a backup is for? Emergency times. Yeah. No, a backup is for like, this guy physically can't go out on the field. He's injured and he can't go out on the field. Not he's playing so poorly. And while your quarterback is playing poorly, it's pretty rare, unless you're in a like Nick Mullins, Josh Dobbs situation where we're already deep into the depth chart, that everything that you saw throughout all of camp and all of the season is suddenly proven wrong because your starter's having an off night, and that the backup that you've had no interest in playing for 2 years, unless you had to, will suddenly come off the bench cold and save you in a playoff game. That's not a thing that I think is a reasonable strategic option. I get it that you look at, a quarterback playing bad and saying, well, we're losing the game. What's he going to do? Lose us the game? How does it get worse? But I can tell you that it can always get worse. And as Vikings fans, we probably should have learned that by now, that they can always find a way to take something bad and make it worse in a way you couldn't have previously imagined. Like that's what they do. That's what they've been doing since their entire existence. Especially all you like YouTube commenters that tell me how long you've been watching the team for. You should know this. So no, I don't think that that's a reasonable strategic option. I take it about as seriously as saying, why didn't Kellen Mond go in for Sean Mannion? Well, because he's worse. Like, do you have to litigate that? Nick Mullins is worse than Sam Darnold's worst day. But yes, true. I don't really think it's ambiguous. James Goonout says, coming at this from a constructive perspective and not a pessimistic one, but having watched the playoffs over the last few weeks, what are some takeaways you have about these teams that make you go, this is why these teams are here in the divisional and conference rounds of the playoffs, and this is what the Vikings need to do to be able to get to that same spot? Something beyond just the Vikings didn't play well when it mattered most. Yeah, look, the Vikings didn't play well when it mattered most, and that is an undeniable and yet frustratingly vague part of this, that it's like unfixable. You can't go back and not choke. All you got to do is say, okay, let's not choke next time. But that does have to be part of it. But okay, so looking at the reason other teams have had success, and I'm not going to go with, well, here are the 4 teams and this is what they do, and therefore every other team should do that. That's a pretty bad heuristic that has been proven wrong in the past with, people looking at past Super Bowl winners and saying, this is what Super Bowl winners, they all pass the ball this much. They strategic decisions is not there's a lot of different kinds of team, and looking at the 4 teams that are still in it excludes the Lions. It excludes a team like Houston. These are good teams that did a lot of good things, that have a lot of good, that you can steal stuff from. And further, I think all 32 teams have stuff you can steal from. Famously, the Philly Special, right? Super Bowl winning team. They stole that from a Chicago Bears team that did not even come close to making the playoffs in a play they rolled out in a meaningless Week 17 game that year against the Vikings, actually. So yeah, I'm not I'm not going to do that. But what I will say is, what is currently working in the league that the Vikings aren't doing? I'll reiterate a point that I had made previewing both of the Lions games, and every time the Lions come up, and Ben Johnson, since he's in the news, the point is diversity. There's another question from grad student in denial who asks, if KOC hired you tomorrow as the Vikings' new run game coordinator, how would you diversify the run game for next year? And the core concepts the Vikings run, they've got some outside zone, inside zone, duo, and a counter. That's kind of their core concepts, and maybe some other, little reverses or end arounds and stuff that we don't have to worry about. If you look at the way the Lions run game is built, or the way the 49ers one was built all the way to the Super Bowl last year, there's a lot of extra motion. There's a lot of different formational stuff. There's a lot more diversity to how they get to those concepts. I think when the Vikings ran, they kind of just, they were using it more as a setup. They wanted it to be predictable because they wanted to trick you into predicting it, and then it's going to be play action. So they would line up, for example, if you saw 2 tight ends, one on either side, and Sam Darnold under center, that is going to be a run or a bootleg or a shot play. Those are the things it's going to be. And I think teams started to understand that there wasn't enough of a package of things that could come out of that. There wasn't a world where you would get a one-step drop slant. That could be a blitz beater. There wasn't a world where you could use motion as a tool to get, different kinds of free releases for quick game or anything like that. There's a lot of stuff left that you can do. And what the Lions had done such a good job of, and why they were so dominant all year, was that they could do a lot of different things out of all of their formations, and they did a good job of teaching stuff. So they just had a bigger menu to select from. That's what I mean when I say diversity. And what's really cool about Washington beating them is that Washington found exploits for a lot of that stuff and found the way to, like, they actually managed to identify a pattern. So what did those teams do that the Vikings didn't? They cracked a code that the Vikings couldn't crack. Maybe that is a Kevin O'Connell critique. That is just a way that Kevin O'Connell failed this time. He's got to do that better next time. I've got a bunch more questions here on the Locked On Vikings podcast, so we are going to keep it going. Coming up next. This episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Doing your taxes used to mean waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting and wondering and worrying a whole bunch more, make sure everything was done right. But now, taxes means matching with a TurboTax expert who can do all of that as soon as today for you. An expert who will give your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. This expert will find every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, that's what taxes means. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only available in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Thanks so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. If you want to go review any of the topics that we talked about all year long, I probably have a Patreon video on it, so go search my Patreon page, patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. Let's move on with this mailbag. The next one comes from Jay Dan, who says, you mentioned on one of your shows that the Vikings offense and defense only have one button to push. Do we trust KOC and Flores' ability for growth to add nuance, or have they hit their ceiling, meaning they only have the answers their mentors have provided? For Flores, I think the answer to that is very easily that we trust his ability to add things and change things. We saw it very clearly between 2023 and 2024. There were existential issues with his blitz packages, with his coverage packages. He came with really interesting solutions to that, and it was really cool to cover all year long. Using more palms, essentially abandoning the blitz rule set that he had used for like 6 or 7 years. There are no hawk blitzes. That was not a thing this year. They just they did not have, A-gap rushers backing off necessarily based on like how the center turns. That became manipulatable, and he dropped it and went with a much simpler and maybe more vanilla blitz strategy, but one that was a little bit sounder in coverage on the back end, and it led to way better statistical output. There are still more problems and more problem solving that needs to be done, but he did it last year. 100% he gets the chance to do it this year, right? For Kevin O'Connell, so here's the deal. Like the one button that they push all the time, right, is long developing plays, usually angling at getting more yards. And I think if you were to look at the Vikings roster with Sam Darnold, Jefferson, Addison, Hawkinson, you would ask, hey, what does this team do best? You would be like, yeah, deep passing. Like that would be the answer. So that's why they did it so much. And I get it. I think they probably just overdid it with, like, yes, that should be the thing you do the most, but they maybe could have dialed it back a little. And it's also like the limitations of Sam Darnold. Is he a quick processing, West Coast quarterback? I don't think they view him that way. And that's probably why they didn't want to push that button anymore. Now, I think you still got to find a way to get the ball out of his hands quickly at some point. Otherwise, he just can't be your quarterback. And maybe we learned that he can't be your quarterback in the last 2 games, and that's what we've learned about Sam Darnold, and now he's out of here. We'll see how the Vikings feel about that, right? That'll be a topic of much intrigue on all the TV shows for the next 2 months. But in terms of, do we trust O'Connell to like make changes based on, year-to-year circumstances? I mean, we've seen him make changes on the fly in the middle of a season as his quarterback changes. I think he tailors things to who his quarterback is. We probably want him to do that. And I think the problem is not being willing to move off of that. If what he tailored for his quarterback isn't working, it might be better to change to something that your quarterback's maybe a little uncomfortable with, but will work against the defenses that you're seeing. Or at least it's worth considering that. I don't know. There are a lot of people in like actual professional football that would hear that sentence and go, no, Luke, you're an idiot, and probably be right. It's actually, I think, an interesting debate, but that's kind of the decision point that we're in. And there might not have been a right answer, but if there was, O'Connell certainly didn't pick it. Purple Nurple asks, how does JJ McCarthy's skill set differ from Darnold's, and how do you see that transitioning to play calling? Darnold is a deep thrower. JJ McCarthy very much not a deep thrower. So if JJ McCarthy is the quarterback next year, you can expect things to quicken up a little bit and be a little bit more. I think McCarthy is good at getting the ball out on time. And I think he's good at working the pocket with those tiny, small little movements. That's actually something I thought Darnold was phenomenal at this year. And I think JJ McCarthy was great at it coming out of Michigan too. Obviously he's a rookie, so he's not going to be as good as a 7-year vet. Even a good rookie, still has growing to do even in his strength areas. But that's, and how do you see that transitioning to play calling? It shortens things. And it's going to be maybe a little bit less of a oops, all shot play offense, which for the first couple of weeks, if teams are watching tape of last year and expecting everything to be like a deep shot down the field, and then they don't get that could work in the Vikings' favor. It could be a little element of surprise. But obviously you still need to there's a long way to go before we get to JJ McCarthy week 1 starter, right? They got to let Sam Darnold go. They got to not bring in somebody that's going to take the job from him. He's got to win a camp competition probably, and so on. Scheissel Fuel asks, we all talk about who we want back with the coaching staff and their extensions. Name one coaching staff member that GM Luke would not bring back. I don't have an answer to this. I think everybody can come back. I think that's totally great. When you have a coaching staff that was so hot, coach of the year odds at times, Kevin O'Connell was minus 1,000 to get coach of the year. I still think he's going to get it. Like, he's winning awards here. Let's not talk about who we're firing. You've got head coaching and promotion interviews for 3 other members of the staff and a member of your front office. The Vikings are very clearly seen league-wide as one of the best staffs in the league. I would let that ride. Jared asks, were the entire NFC North frauds, or is winning playoff games just hard? Man, winning playoff games is hard. I feel like what happened to the Lions is like proof positive that if you lose in the playoffs, that is not evidence that you were fraudulent all season. I am taking 17 games of evidence over one, even if the one turned out to be the one that's decisive. The one is more important. The 17 are more instructive. And we have to be able to divide those things in our brain and compartmentalize them if we don't want to end up saying some really stupid stuff like the Lions weren't secretly good. They were insanely talented and good. And they lost because they didn't have the right day. Injuries caught up to him, etc. Go listen to Matt Derry. I'm sure he's got plenty of talk and reasons why that happened. But it does not invalidate the season that they had. And for practical purposes, like for the Lions and Packers and Vikings, all of those teams are looking at their teams and going, okay, we did this well, that well, that well, that well. We shouldn't change those things, right? The Lions are looking at their team and saying, well, okay, Xavier McKinney, we're happy with him. The Lions are looking and saying we should probably still run the ball more, and they're making correct decisions by not getting too bogged down in the fact that they lost a playoff game. Can you imagine if the Lions lost a playoff game and went, we got to get rid of Jared Goff, we got to get rid of Jahmyr Gibbs. This is a fun team, but it's clearly not working. Fire the whole O-line, get rid of Hank Fraley, and Dan Campbell's got to go too. Could you imagine that? Because they went one and done in the playoffs? No, it'd be an idiotic move that would be way too reactive. I don't think anybody really holds this stuff too closely once you get further away from the moment, and you get a little distance and you're thinking about free agency again, and then you start going, they were pretty good at a lot of stuff. Jordan Larson asks, is Garett Bradberry good at identifying blitzes and calling out assignments? And Jordan was asking more in a should we replace him kind of way. So my understanding is that Bradberry is in charge of identifying blitzes and stuff. And also, he said, if you have a young quarterback coming in, is this something that he's good at? Yes, I think he can do that. He basically took the entire mantle of that for the second half of 2023 when there were backups shuffling in and out that, Josh Dobbs cannot deal with this. Garett, you got it. He did that fine. But when it comes to identifying blitzes and making protection calls in particular, the center's job is a very, very subjective one. And it's really fascinating to watch, but it's not very interesting to judge. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a subjective call to guess who is blitzing and who isn't, because the defense is entirely designed to make that not like inconsistent, right? To make that difficult to predict, right? So it has to be based on a little bit of tape study. If you notice patterns, hey, whenever they walk this guy up, that guy blitzes, that kind of stuff. If you do that, you're doing great. If you sniff it out, good job. But if you just like look at a play and I ask you like who's blitzing, if you did like 10 of them, I'm telling you right now, you are not going to go 10 for 10. You will be wrong a whole bunch of the time. And so you have to go, okay, who's most likely to blitz? And if that turns out to be wrong, well, then the defense just did something that you didn't see coming, good for them. And it's like, or did you make a decision that like, well, it was really unlikely that safety up there was blitzing. Why'd you turn the protection toward him? Weird call. And I think it's a really subjective and debatable thing a lot of the time. So it's really hard for me to say if a center is good at making calls that are like super, like I can say I agree or I disagree with this many percentage of them, but I don't know if I'm right either. So it's hard. His reputation is that he knows how to do it. They trust him to do it. So I guess that's where that is. And if JJ McCarthy is the quarterback, they'll 100% trust him to do it. But in terms of my opinion on how good he is, really hard to pin down. Ball Newer asks, Brandel seemed to do worse without Darisaw on the field. Do you think that factors into the willingness to run it back with him? Willingness to run it back with him, I don't know if that was going to happen anyways. That die might be cast regardless of Darisaw. But it's just a universal truth. Like when you put a worse tackle next to a guy, that guy's going to look worse, especially when it's like, hey, I haven't communicated with this guy all year. We don't know each other. The angles are weird. Here's a Cam Robinson thing. So Cam Robinson blocks square. The Vikings block on the angle. If you know what I mean by that, then this probably makes sense immediately. But like the Vikings like to block on an angle to their rushers. So if there's an outside rusher to them, they're going to turn their hips to that guy and try to be kind of like dead on straight with him, square to the defender, not square to the line of scrimmage. Cam Robinson goes square to the line of scrimmage. This is just two different schools of thought of how to teach something. I actually prefer the way Cam Robinson does it, but not when you're in a line that's blocking on the angle, because everybody's at a little angle and they try to make a little bow, like a nice little, arch for their pocket. And if you have one guy in there that turns, it's like a revolving door. It's like a lavatory door. You push in on it and it opens, right? And it creates like a physical and structural weak point that was taken advantage of a lot in the last couple games. I think that's why Cam Robinson's that's why I wouldn't bring Cam Robinson back, is I guess the way I will put it. I think he's more primed to have success elsewhere if he wants to, keep doing that. People are like, what if we brought him back and brought him to guard or whatever? It's like, that doesn't solve the problem that he had. It just puts it at a different position. So I don't think that factors into the willingness to bring Brandel back. I think that the evaluation is more personal to Brandel than that. How he struggled to pick up stunts, how he actually got some pretty good push in the run game. Like those things matter a lot more, but it does factor into the willingness, I think, to bring Cam Robinson back. I've got a few more questions that I'm going to try to rip through here on the Locked On Vikings podcast, so let's keep it going soon. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime, the best place to find last-minute tickets. If you live in, say, the Philadelphia or Kansas City area and you want to try to get to one of these championship games, or shoot, maybe if you live in New Orleans, you're trying to get Super Bowl tickets, check out Gametime. When these tickets go on, especially this is what we learned when the Vikings game got moved to Arizona, that like season ticket holder windows, usually they'll have like an exclusive window. A lot of those tickets go up on resale, and Gametime can like navigate that market and get you absolutely unreal prices. I saw people who actually DM'd me pictures of their view from like row 4 and were like, yeah, I paid $100 a ticket for this to a playoff NFL game. And then like 2 hours later, those same tickets were like $1,000. That's the power of Gametime. They have all kinds of ways to sort and filter for what you want, and even their all-in pricing option, which you turn that on and you can see what you're going to pay at checkout. No hidden fees, no surprises, no nothing. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Let's move on here with the Locked On Vikings podcast. The next one comes from Kevin, although I'm pretty sure this is Sam, who says, now that you've watched Tyler Booker, are you salivating at the thought of putting him at left guard as a mauling presence next to Christian Darrisaw? So yeah, I this person knows that I watched Tyler Booker, the Alabama guard, and here you go, first draft take of the season. Yeah, everybody's right about him. He's a good player, and he's probably going to go like late first, early second. If they picked him at 24, I'd be pretty stoked on that. Yep, I'm pretty much right in line with the masses on that one. There's nothing too surprising there. Are you salivating at the thought of putting him at left guard? Man, yeah, I would like that. I think that would be a good use of a first round pick to be. I know like first round guard is weird, but later in the first round, it's the value gets a lot, like it flattens out. It starts to flatten out real fast, like quite a bit real fast. So I'm not going to go into like positional values. Like just take a good player. Tyler Booker's a good player in my opinion. So that would be fine. And yeah, he's like a mean, nasty MF, and putting him next to Darrisaw, those double teams would be pretty nuts. He can pull, he can do everything you need to do. It's just the deal with him is that he's like not that mobile in space. I actually think his footwork is pretty maximized. Like I think he does the footwork right, which means it's just kind of, he's just a little bit of a slower player, but not in a way that makes him, that's like a deal breaker at all. It's just like, oh, all right, well, if you're like running a pin pull screen and you need him to run out to a safety, he might be a little bit slow there. But like only in those situations does that come up, and I'm not too worried about it. Also, Kevin, but this one I'm pretty sure is Arch, says, provided the Vikings look for another starting linebacker, what should they look for to complement Cashman and Pace? Do they need one? So no, there's not really a world for a third inside linebacker in a Brian Flores defense. And even if Brian Flores does, like, say, go take the Jets job, whoever they replace him with will probably be running a similar 3-4 scheme, whether it's, somebody else that runs a Belichick 3-4 like Gerard Mayo, or whether it's an internal promotion like Durante Jones. You're probably going to have, you might not have all the same crazy Flores things, but you probably have the same like general structure. You're not going to make everybody learn a new, like entirely new structure like when Donatel left and Flores got here in the first place. That's like quite the cost to incur for kind of no reason. So assuming that that's the case, there are two starting linebacker jobs. Cashman and Pace have them both. I think replacing those two guys, look, if Luke Kuechly walks through that door, okay, we can figure something out. But it certainly won't be a priority when cornerback is so barren right now, and they've got, they're maybe going to want to make switches on the line, and you got defensive line problems. You got to figure out what to do with your quarterback room around JJ McCarthy. Like there's all kinds of other needs that need to happen here, that come before linebacker. So do they need one? No. But if they are going to look for another starting linebacker, I think a gap shooter as like a rotational player is probably the deal. You kind of want backup Cashman and backup Pace, right? Cashman very all around. Pace is much more of a like downhill player. So having both of those guys on the field, they can kind of cover each other, right? You can have Cashman, just do a nice zone drop, do your thing. He can blitz. He can do a little bit of everything. And then, Ivan Pace, point and shoot, right? So you want a point and shoot guy, which actually, honestly, Brian Asamoah as a backup point and shoot guy would be nice. But they didn't try him at all, even with all the injuries. So that's probably not happening. But in that style, but maybe somebody who's a little bit less head empty than Asamoah is. And for Cashman, you want somebody who's a little bit bigger, who can take on a guard block, but who isn't like big, slow, lumbering Ben Getty, and you're not looking for that. So yeah, guys in that same mold that can be backups. That's the kind of linebacker acquisition we're looking for. We're looking for a Kamu Grugier-Hill replacement, though, not to spend resources upgrading on players who had pretty good seasons. Nano Garces asks, do you think that we need an offensive coordinator that makes the calls and develops the game plan? So my understanding is that developing the game plan is Wes Phillips's primary responsibility. He draws them. And that was Kevin O'Connell's main job in Los Angeles with the Rams for McVay. So now O'Connell's the McVay and Wes Phillips is the O'Connell. That's my understanding of the Vikings structure. But I think generally, we had this conversation a lot with Mike Zimmer, and I've seen just about every other fan base have this conversation. I think it's a universal thing that when a team loses a game, people go, well, maybe the head coach should be thinking about less. And if you want to start taking power away from that head coach, you're probably just arguing to fire that guy. a lot of offensive head coaches call the plays. It's not a thing that is unique to the Vikings. He could be a delegator and a CEO if he wanted to, but that's not the kind of style the Vikings bought into. That's not the plan that Kevin O'Connell presented to the Wilfs when he interviewed, and so that's not the plan the Wilfs selected. That's just kind of not what they're doing. Sure, you could have a CEO type. That can work out well too, but not this guy. He ain't that guy. If you want a CEO type, then you should start advocating to fire Coach of the Year. And I don't know if that's going to go over great. You probably got to bide your time on that one a little more. Final question comes from Blimby, who asks, was it fun to cover the Vikings this year? Man, was it fun to cover the Vikings. Oh my goodness, was it awesome to cover the Vikings. I mean, look, it is so much more fun when they win than when they lose. Of course. Like it's a lot harder to for me to come up with passionate topics when I'm watching my favorite team get, blasted every single Sunday. That sucks. I don't like it. I'll do it, but I don't like it nearly as much as when I get to go look at them conquering a new thing that they were supposed to not be able to conquer every single week. How many times did they go in and win straight up games that they were heavy underdogs in? The whole first part of the season was their, 8-point underdogs, 4-point underdogs, 3-point underdogs against the Packers. And they just went out and won those games outright. Not even covered, just won. That was awesome. And Sam Darnold was so much fun to watch. It's super fun for me. I learned a lot about quarterbacking this year because of the draft, because the Vikings were going to pick one. So I learned about all the quarterbacks and then applying that knowledge to what Sam Darnold did and understanding what was different about him from his time in New York to now was so cool. It was so awesome. I loved it so much. Not to mention, I get to do this every single day to an audience of people who are just as, if not more, passionate about it than I am. That's so cool. I'm so unbelievably thankful and grateful for that all the time. And even if they are 0-17, boy, I still get to do this with you guys. That rules. I'm super happy about it all the time. Never get it. Even in days when I'm frustrated. That's the thing about being a daily podcaster is if I'm having a bad day, you see me on that day too. But even on those days, in the grand scheme of things, I'm not missing the forest for the trees. This is awesome. Here's to another 25,000 years of it. Absolutely. Love it. I'll see y'all tomorrow. And as always, Skull.